To figure out, for example, what counts as a measurement. This is an issue in psychology. How do you measure a mental state? Well, psychology really likes to use numbered scales. 1 to 7. Give me your answer on this thing. And I'll just give you one example of how this is problematic. So let's say you have a scale and you want to measure whether people are more liberal or more conservative. And a standard way of doing this is just a one-item measure where you say, 1 equals very conservative and 7 equals very liberal. And people just mark where they are on the scale. Now, in order to do the standard statistics on the scale, certain things have to be true of the scale in terms of its ability to measure whatever is out there, this actual, tendency to be more liberal or conservative. And one thing that has to be true is that the difference between a 1 and a 2 on the scale has to be the same as the difference between a 6 and a 7. It has to be measuring the same kind of mental tendency or political tendency out there. The problem is that's not really the case. Very few people are willing to put themselves on the extreme ends of the scale because saying I'm a 1 or a 7 is really a strong statement.
Right.
So most people put themselves somewhere in the middle of the scale. And that means that if you do put yourself on a 1 or a 7, you're actually way far out there in terms of your political tendencies, at least in terms of your self-identification. And what this means is the scale is not mapping on in a one-to-one relationship with the phenomenon out there.
Right.
However you want to conceptualize it. And so most of the statistical tests you would use on this scale are invalid from the start. But to work out how you do a valid measurement of a mental state or a political disposition or something like that is an extraordinarily complex epistemological problem. And it's simply kind of boring for a lot of people who work in the field. So they're kind of happy to use numbered scales without really interrogating what would have to be true of this scale for the statistics I'm using on it to be valid statistics. There are some people who work on that, but they publish in obscure journals.
Now, this just to me sounds like pure philosophy. It sounds like all what you're talking about is just really epistemology. What would have to be true in order for this to be true and this to be a reliable method, which I think is wonderful. I think these questions are of the utmost importance. Maybe that's why I'm biased here, because I find like that you have to have. It almost seems like you should have these discussions before even undertaking the projects. When you say that. The example with the numbered scale, there's also the question of the relationship between self-reported political beliefs and if somehow you could measure actual political beliefs. So somebody might consider themselves, a 3, but actually in practice they support, policies that would be more liberal. How do you measure something like that?
Right. I mean, psychologists have been aware for a long time of the problems of self-report. There are many of them. One is that people often don't know their own minds. Another is that people are often motivated to respond in ways that they think the experimenter wants them to respond. This is called socially desirable responding. And there are various methods that have been proposed to try to account for these kinds of things, but they aren't always employed. So, I've written a critique of a study in a medical journal where they asked questions in such a way that it was almost like leading the witness, and then they got the answers that they expected, and they had no measure or even attempt to assess, are these participants giving answers that we want to hear? And if you don't account for that, the answer doesn't mean anything at all. It just means that they told you what you wanted to hear. That's not a reliable measure of their actual mental state.
Right.
And so, even the measures that have been invented are kind of imperfect. I'll just tell you one of them as an example. So there are these socially desirable responding measures that basically give people a set of questions where it's very unlikely that a certain answer is true, but it's the socially desirable answer. And so if a person consistently gives the socially desirable answer that just has a very low base rate possibility that that's the case. Either they're an extraordinary person in this regard, and you just have a sample full of extraordinary people, which is unlikely, or people are showing a tendency to respond in the way that they think you want them to.
Right.
And when that's true, you can identify those people who have that tendency, and you can compensate for their effect on whatever it is that you're investigating. So these are the sorts of tools that have been developed, and when they are employed, I think that's very good. But certainly psychologists are aware of self-report problems, but they're hard to get around. No matter which way you try.